believe it or not, change is okay. We were all thinking it. Change really is okay. We can do things differently and it's all right. Little different lead-in than what I had planned, but I continue to notice how different my children are as they grow. And I shared the story with Pat this morning. I've shared it with a couple of you, but I want to share it because it shows to me that what we do here really matters. The lessons that Brian and Pat and Tricia and Jess teach our kids, and Joanne, go to Joanne too, the lessons that we teach our kids, they really do have an impact. And you never know exactly what they're picking up. Now, I shared that I was kind of talking about Allie and Alex, and they are so different. Allie, forever, when we put her to bed, she went to bed within a few minutes. You know, it might be a little bit of a struggle to get her in bed, but once she was there, she was asleep within 5 minutes, maybe 10 tops. A very rough night, 15. But usually a few minutes of laying her down, she was out, and she was out for a good 12 hours. That has never been Alex. Alex doesn't like to go to bed. And even when he goes to bed, he doesn't like to go to sleep because he might miss something. And he's the child that if you take one step into the kitchen, he's awake. You know, he knows what's going on. He doesn't want to miss anything. And he started a few weeks ago coming out and sharing with us at bedtime. Now, this would be after the drink of water, after an extra hug and kiss, after another story, after another song, after being tucked back in, after having to go to the bathroom because he had the drink, you know, all of these things. And every now and then we'd look back and see him in the bathroom. He was getting another drink. He came up with a new one, and it started a few weeks ago. He walked out the first night, and he's like, "Mommy, we have troubles." And he would proceed to tell her whatever was going on his mind. And some days he was really worried. Some days I know it was just a made-up story to get a little bit of extra attention. And some nights he would come out, "Mommy, we have problems." But last Sunday night, 2 weeks ago, he came out with one that, frankly, I could have never dreamed that he would have shared. Now, our kids make lots of crafts in their lessons and stuff that helps them really understand the lessons that are being taught. And so he came running out and he says, "Mommy, I've lost Jesus. I know he's in my heart, but I've lost him." I said, "Huh?" Well, he had made, I said to Jen, I said, "What happened?" She's like, "Oh, you know, the kids made like popsicle stick figures in class, and they had Jesus and some of the disciples, and you know, and that's what he's talking about." I did not know that, but he'd been playing with them all day long. And so he comes running out, he's like, "Mommy, I've lost Jesus. I know he's in my heart, but I can't find him." And then he goes on, "And I've got to find him because I can't go back to church school next week and tell Miss Pat I've lost him." So I was cracking up. So we go back, we move the blankets, and sure enough, there's Jesus under the covers. Picks him up. "Mommy, I found Jesus." So Allie never heard him. She never heard anything that was happening. But he was so excited to have found what he was looking for. That little stick figure of Jesus meant the world to him. And he was starting to understand who Jesus really is. The fact that he could say, "You know, I lost Jesus. I know he's in my heart, but I can't find him." Those are good lines, right? Those are good truths. And in fact, we would do well as adults to remember the truth of that. Because sometimes when we look at our lives, we know Jesus is in our heart, but we can't find him. We miss what we're supposed to be doing with Jesus. And so we end up looking for him and wondering the question of, where is Jesus? Where are you at? And I'll tell you, one of the greatest times that we see Jesus often missing is when we begin to talk about the topic of forgiveness. Not the forgiveness between us and God, because if we've been in church long enough to know, we know that God forgives us. We may struggle with forgiving ourselves. We may struggle with understanding that God really has forgiven us. We at least know that it's a concept. But the real struggle for forgiveness begins to occur when it relates to other people, especially when they really hurt us, or maybe I don't like them, or maybe they deserve what's coming to them now. That's when we struggle with Jesus. Not forgiving or seeking revenge always has a consequence. And I was looking for fun, cool illustrations to kind of begin with, and I found an illustration that I don't believe I've ever used before, that I've ever really even seen before. But it's a story of Dale Carnegie visiting Yellowstone Park where he saw a grizzly bear. Now that is not very rare. You know, if you go out to Yellowstone, I hear that there are lots of grizzly bears out there. And what the bear was doing wasn't really unique. The bear had ravaged some food from some campers, had drug it out into the middle of the field, and there was this grizzly bear eating the meal that it had taken from some scared campers probably, and feasting away, and nobody dared challenge the bear except the skunk. There's these animals that Carnegie could see out around the edge of the field away from the bear, and lo and behold, doesn't a skunk walk out into the field, make his way to the food pile, and sit down and begin to eat. It was the only animal in the world that probably could have done that and survived. Right? Because objecting to the skunk's presence would have big consequences for the bear. Sometimes we don't understand the consequences that not forgiving has. You'll think about that the next time you see a skunk or a bear. We let skunks do whatever they want to do, right? We give them grace, we give them space to do whatever they need to do. And we might grumble, but we're not going to get even because it costs way too much. Our sermon text today is going to be the Gospel of Luke. If you have your Bibles, the Gospel of Luke chapter 6. Matthew has the Sermon on the Mount. Luke has the Sermon on the Flat. And so these are some of the same teachings that we read in Matthew, but they're grouped together a little differently in Luke. And we're going to look this morning, we're going to break this section into two sections. There's actually a lot of little teachings within it, but Luke has them grouped together. We're going to leave them mostly grouped together, but we're going to put two different focuses on them that I want you to see because of the ways that they're grouped. So it's Luke chapter 6, starting with verse 37. We're going to go up to verse 42. And the subtitle that I have is on judging others. It says, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." He also told them this parable. "Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A student is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take that speck out of your eye,' when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." You know, there are many passages that are well known by churched and unchurched alike. That last part is one of them. Take the plank out of your own eye before you try to get the speck out of mine, right? It's one that we've heard, one that we've understood, one that we've used, perhaps correctly or incorrectly. But I want to go back to these first two verses, verses 37 and 38, where we're talking about not judging. These two topics are based around something very, very interesting, but something that I think we might miss. Who do you tell not to do something? People who are doing it, right? For example, I don't say to my children, "Don't color on the wall," unless they're coloring on the wall. I don't say to them, "Don't color on the table," unless they're coloring on the table. Do you start to see where this is going? So when Jesus is saying here, "Do not judge, do not condemn," who's he talking to? He's talking to the people in the crowd who were doing it. There were people in this crowd who had gotten very good at judging, very good at condemning. And Luke, if you go back and look at it, he is extremely clear. Paraphrase, stop it. The way you can almost translate this is stop judging, stop condemning, stop putting people down. I want you to take a moment and think about this text for a moment. It is easy to judge. It is easy to condemn. And I think about that stuff with my kids. Days go by and I don't say to them, stop coloring on the walls. That didn't recently happen, but it was one that has happened a number of times. In fact, when we painted, I bought paint that crayons came off of easily. And over the years, I've thrown markers away that don't come off for those reasons. But it is so easy to fall into this, to forget. Because, frankly, sometimes we don't see God doing enough judging. We laugh. But don't you have some instances where you would like to see God be a little bit more proactive in judgment? Joanne would call it smiting. Don't we all have situations where we would be okay if God says, you're getting what's coming to you? Be honest, you are in church. And be honest anyway, because God knows your heart. We all have areas, and when we see God go light on judging, we assume that somehow God has neglected his duties and has asked us for help. That's the twofold assumption that we make. That because God is not actively judging this person and condemning them for what they have done, that somehow as busy as God is, God just set that to the side and needs my help so that they can be judged appropriately. We would never say it that way, but that's exactly what we do. Does that make sense? Yes. I'm learning this more and more as Allie tells Alex what to do. She's very quick to point out the things he does wrong. She's very quick to let him know, Daddy doesn't like that. Mommy said you can't do that. And Alex kind of looks at her and he's at that age yet where he's not sure whether he should listen or just keep going with what he's doing. But we do the same thing. When we don't see God active the way we think God should be, we step into that void and help it to happen as we think it should. There were a lot of people who were really getting irritated with Jesus as Jesus was teaching. Because Jesus, who was righteous, Jesus, who was religious by many standpoints, Jesus, who is this great teacher and rabbi, was not doing the things that many of their rabbis had done. In fact, instead of telling people they weren't welcome, he was bringing people to the table who society knew were not welcome. Does that make sense? Instead of Jesus looking at people and saying, you're not welcome here, he actually opened the door or made spaces at the table and said, come join me. And it really began to irritate people because these were people, tax collectors, prostitutes, sinners, people that had done things that good church people abhorred. And not only was Jesus not judging them, he was bringing them in. And frankly, there was something that bothers us about people being let off the hook. People getting away with things, unless it's us, right? How many of you have ever had someone fly by you on the interstate only to see them pulled over? What were your thoughts? And I bet there have been times when people flew by you on the interstate and you thought, I hope they get what's coming to them, right? And when you see a cop that hasn't pulled them over, it's like, I can't believe they got away with that. I put that up because it shows us this desire that we don't like people to get away with stuff. We think if we're following the rules, so should they. And they ought to be following our rules. They ought to be doing it the way that we do it. And so all of these people in the crowd were really getting upset. They were really getting frustrated because not only did Jesus fail to condemn them, Jesus invited them in. And they were really getting irritated. And they saw it as a great lapse in God's judgment, multiple ways. Not only that God would have a Messiah who wasn't judging people, but that God himself was then not judging these people and allowing them to come in. We don't like it when people get off the hook. Well, how does that relate to forgiveness? It relates very, very simply. It is hard to forgive someone when we think they deserve what's coming to them. Or when we're secretly hoping that they get the judgment that they deserve. You cannot forgive someone and hope that they get what's coming to them. It doesn't work. It would have been impossible for them to forgive the people that Jesus was inviting in and say, you're not welcome. Does that make sense? They don't fit together. And so we look at this and we say, well, judging isn't the same as forgiving, but Luke has them clearly linked. Luke says, do not judge, do not condemn, forgive and you will be forgiven. And then he goes on to talk about the measure that you use will be the one used for you. A good measure, pressed down, running over. Sometimes people get bent out of shape. Well, what was the measure? It doesn't matter. Whatever you're using for others is what will be used for you. And the way they talk about this being run over, being overflowing in your lap, discretion here, please. How many of you have one of those nice cloth bathrobes that you ever use? I have one that I use it in the wintertime, and I enjoy it. And when I sit down with the belt, there is this area that opens up over my belly, and there's this little bit of a flap there. Anybody else understand that? Okay. So when it talks, this was what everybody wore in Jesus' time. A cloak like that. And so when they would sit down, there was all this extra fabric that would come out and kind of flap open. And when they talk about the measure and it running over, guess where it was running to? It was running right into that cavity that's created in the cloth. It was running right into their lap. And there was so much coming that even that flap, as big as it may be, couldn't hold it all. Think about that. So much coming to you that a bathrobe can't contain it. You will never look at a bathrobe the same way. You will never think about it the same way. And that's the point, because Jesus was so amazing at using stuff that was everyday items to help us understand the impact in the kingdom. And this fits in the kingdom because many of us are not comfortable in a kingdom where sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes are welcome and they're not getting what we think they deserve. Does that make sense? So here is Jesus with this group of followers, and a chunk of them are really angry because Jesus isn't holding the standard that they think he should. Jesus isn't giving to them what they're supposed to get. Frankly, it really bothers us when God doesn't do that. When God doesn't give the consequence that we believe God should give. And I think it raises one of our biggest insecurities in life. It is a fear or an insecurity that God doesn't really care, or that God is somehow unaware of the problems that we're experiencing. Anybody ever dealt with that? And you don't have to raise your hand, you don't have to. But I think if we're honest, doubt sometimes creeps in. And the way that we deal with doubt is to become more rigid and more unwavering in our viewpoints. So that if we stay strong in this, if we don't give anything in this, then we'll be okay, and we know that God will honor us because we've done the right thing. It's a way that many of us try and overcompensate. But what we see here is Jesus actually confronting the ones who are saying, hey, wait a minute. You're upset because God hasn't moved the way you thought God would move. You're upset because God didn't put them down the way you think God should have put them down. And I want you to understand something. If you can't forgive them, it's going to be really difficult for you to be forgiven. Forgiveness does not just stop with me. Forgiveness does not just stop with you. This has been one of the biggest challenges that I think we have in our society, that we have taught that God forgives each and every one of us, and I fully believe that. But it's this idea that I am the only thing connected to God's forgiveness. That as God rains forgiveness, it comes straight down through a channel to me, and I am the container for God's forgiveness, and it doesn't go anywhere else. And in the same way, you have a channel that comes down with God's forgiveness, and you are forgiven, but it doesn't extend to anyone else. And James is doing the same thing for you. Channel of God's forgiveness, it comes down for you, and it doesn't extend to anyone else. That is not how forgiveness works. As forgiveness comes down, it absolutely comes into us, but then it is to go out of us. Connecting. Does that make sense? Because if I fail to forgive the people around me because I want them to get what's coming to them, I clearly don't understand forgiveness. And there are multiple parables that teach about this throughout the Gospels. Of Jesus saying forgiveness has to not only come into you, but go out of you so that you truly understand what it means. Does that make sense? It's a little different approach to forgiveness because we always talk about being forgiven for our sins, and that is absolutely part one of this. But the part two is it being extended to those around us. Meaning, I find it very difficult for a Christian, one who claims to be born again, one who is a Christ follower, a recipient of God's forgiveness, to hold grudges with multiple people. It just doesn't fit. If you're carrying around the list of ways that you've been hurt so that you can keep track and make sure that they get theirs, then something didn't take with the forgiveness. Does that make sense? Okay. And I start with this idea of we don't like people getting off the hook because this is the heart of it. We want to make sure that they've really earned that forgiveness. Because for many of us, God has made us earn ours. God has made us earn our forgiveness. And the reality is, what Scripture tells us, is that we could never repay all the wrongs that we had done. We would never be able to balance the scales, although many of us try and live this way. But somehow we give ourselves a pass and we fail to do it for others. Does that make sense? Do you see the disconnect in the way we often talk about forgiveness with us and forgiveness when it relates to others? As Luke begins to move on with the second section that he puts together here, it's verses 39 to 42. This section begins to revolve around our eyes. They're the things that we see, the way that we navigate this world. And he starts off with, can a blind man lead a blind man? I'm going to tell you the answer in that is yes. Well, no, the answer is no. No, we do it all the time. We see blind people leading blind, having no idea where they're going. Right? Can a blind lead a blind? Absolutely. Do they have a successful chance, or a probable chance of getting where they're going? No. They may both end up getting hurt, right? So can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? So can it happen? Yes. Will it be successful? Probably not. They're probably both going to get hurt. And yet we are very quick to follow anyone who might agree with the point that we already believe to be true. We have no idea where this person stands, how they're living, what they're doing, the way their life is played out. And yet we're very quick to follow along just because it matches a point that we already believe to be true. Jesus goes on talking about this, that a student is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. We often separate what happens in the company and leadership and what happens in a personal life. But what Jesus is talking about here, the way things happen in the personal life will impact things that happen in the company life. And so if you are following someone who doesn't have their personal life together, you are going to get implications of that. In families, we call it generational patterns. Often with our children, we teach with the model of do as I say, but how do children learn? Do as we do. I remind myself of this when I watch my kids do things that frustrates me because it's stuff that I've done or do. And I say to myself, Jamie, you know where they learned that. Clearly, it's Jen. She's not even here today to defend herself. No, it's me. It's me. But isn't it amazing when you hear kids say stuff that you know's come out of your mouth? They're becoming like their teacher. And Jesus is clearly saying to us, watch who you're following. Pay attention to who is training you. Look at who is leading you. Not just at the stuff they say, but the places that they're doing and the way they live on a daily basis, because if you're not careful, you will become like them. Or you'll end up in the same place as them. Does that make sense? And the blind leading the blind, the sawdust and the log or the board, they all deal with reflection. Interpersonal reflection. Stopping to assess and to see where things are. Which is what this whole thing has to do with, because if we're going to really forgive someone, then we have to be honest about who we are and understanding the things that we need to be forgiven for or that we have been forgiven for. You know, in some of the recovery settings, you might call it a personal inventory. Perhaps sometimes it's even a gratitude list. A lot of different ways that you can phrase it. But it's going through and looking at our life and saying, you know what? This is an area where I know I've been forgiven. This is an area where I know I've been forgiven. This is something that I know I have been forgiven for. Have you ever made, and I've referred to them in the past, as kind of a sin walk? And I like to be clear on this. This is not where you go out and walk and have a great time sinning. This is where you take a walk through the sins that you have been forgiven of. Because amazing things happen. When I start to create the list of the sins that God has forgiven me of, and I begin to see that it's maybe a little longer than I thought at first glance, I become aware of how much I needed God's forgiveness, which then in turn helps me to have more forgiveness for people who I would rather see be put on the hook. Does that make sense? So you look at how this begins to relate. If I don't ever stop and look at where I'm at, it'll be very, very easy to stand in the crowd that Jesus was standing and sharing with, stop judging, stop condemning. So forgiveness. Not just for us, but for everyone around us. So how do people know? Because for me, it's all about application. I mean, learning the Bible stuff, learning what we understand, understanding what is being taught here is wonderful, and amassing knowledge is wonderful, but it's all application for me. If you can't apply what you've learned, it doesn't matter. Does that make sense? Call it where the rubber hits the road. I know that's one of Mary Ann's favorite sayings. Where does this hit the road for you? For me, it means that I don't have a list of people that I'm waiting to see get their just desserts. It means that I don't have a list of grudges that I continue to run through so that I don't forget. It means that when I'm tempted to point out how bad someone's behavior is to God, I may not need to do it because God probably knows. Just like God knew mine. And it frees me up to not have to play God's role of being judge. Now, I know the temptation in this is that it sounds like it's saying, well, Pastor Jim, you're just saying everything goes, don't point out anything that's wrong. And so let's talk about that for just a minute and then we'll close. It's so easy to say that without justice and fairness, grace turns into permissiveness. Does that make sense? Without justice and fairness, grace turns into permissiveness. And I don't see Jesus as one who said anything goes, do whatever you want. However, without grace, justice becomes cruelty. Do you see how those two partner together? Without justice and fairness, grace turns into permissiveness. And without grace, justice becomes cruelty. Which is what Jesus was talking about right here at the beginning with the judgment and the condemning. So it's both. And one of the ways that we can keep this locked together is that understanding just as much as God loves me, God lets me be me in Him. Does that make sense? God lets me be me in Him. I don't become a robot the moment that I accept Christ. I'm allowed to keep my personality and everything that comes with that, and God continues to use it. So one final part with forgiveness, one final takeaway. Forgiveness is love towards the unlovely. Unlovely in us, unlovely in those around us. And I think those are things that if we keep them in mind, it'll actually help us when it comes time to forgive others. When it comes time to wrestle with the concept of, am I truly forgiven? And I'm working more and more to have forgiveness with people when they fly by me on the interstate. Or when they mess up the rotation at the stop signs. Or when they're clearly not paying attention and the light's green. For me, those are just little things. But it's a great marker for me of where I'm at. Because if I go off the handle because somebody has taken too long at the stop sign, there's a bigger problem going on. That make sense? By the way, that's not just for me. That's for you too. So Pastor Jamey has a problem here. I don't. I don't know. Keep it in mind.
Yeah.
Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for time together. Thank you for the Gospel of Luke and this message on forgiveness. God, it is so easy to judge. It is so easy to condemn, especially when we don't see you condemning fast enough. God, thank you for condemning at your pace and not ours. Thank you for judging in your ways by your measure and not ours. God, thank you for forgiving us, for wiping our slate clean. God, help us to do it for others. Help us to forgive others the way you have forgiven us. Fully, completely, without reminder. God, may we be your agents of forgiveness in this city, in this town, in our homes, in our workplaces, every single day. And thanks for this time together. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.